Hello, and welcome to this episode of Strange as It Seems, a podcast about history, occultism, espionage, secret societies, mystery, conspiracy, and weirdness high and low. The common denominator is that the topics all embody the strange, that is, something that's unusual or surprising in a way that's unsettling or hard to understand. The aim is to reveal and discuss, but without any definite expectation of explaining or proving anything. Because, more often than not, the closer you look at the strange, the stranger it gets. Here we are, Stephen, for another episode of Strange as It Seems. And for those out there listening, yes, it has been a while. We are overdue for one, but once again, life tends to get in the way. There are other things going on, so we'll try to keep the 2-week pace up. Maybe we'll get one out quicker, but here we are now. This is what we have, and this one is, it always depends. I'm always surprised in some cases what attracts more attention than other ones. I still don't quite understand the popularity of the Green Dragon. I appreciate it, but why that one? Nevertheless, this is something quite different from that, but it is, hands down, one of the most bizarre and puzzling cases that I've looked at in recent memory. And what we're going to be talking about is the case of the Gulf Breeze 6. Now, some people might be thinking that we're going to be talking about the Gulf Breeze UFO incident. That was back in 1987, 1988, where a local man by the name of Ed Walters would claim that he had seen UFOs. And we'll recap that story in a bit. But that attracted national news and some attention. And that plays a small part in the story we're going to be talking about today. I mean, it's one of those things that may have a lot to do with what happens. It may have absolutely nothing to do with what happens. Now, the Gulf Breeze 6 is a different case. It takes place in the summer of 1990. And maybe the place to start off with is, from an historian standpoint, is to give some kind of context of what the summer of 1990 means, other than being the summer of 1990. Well, one of the things that had happened the previous fall is that the Eastern Bloc had effectively collapsed. The Berlin Wall had come down and communist regimes had essentially collapsed throughout Eastern Europe, but not as yet in the Soviet Union. So the summer of 1990 is a kind of strange transitional period. The old communist governments through Eastern Europe have largely crumbled, although large portions of them are still hanging on in places like Albania and even in Romania. In fact, the communists never entirely go away. They just change their name. And the USSR is there. It still has about a year to go before the critical events of 1991. So the Russians are still out there. The Cold War is still on. No one has necessarily called it off just yet. East Germany is going out of business, but it's not completely out of business. And I can actually attest to that because, interestingly enough, in the summer, in this same period, in July and August of 1990, I was traveling in Germany and in what was then still kind of East Germany. I mean, the border was open. You could just go in, you could walk around. The Berlin Wall was gone. But if you went into the Eastern Zone, everybody's still walking around in their DDR uniforms. I don't know who's paying them, if anybody was. But so Germany is not yet unified. That is still some months away. So it's a transitional period. The Cold War seems to be ending, but the USSR is still there. NATO, in terms both militarily and in intelligence work, is still doing its thing, which is going to be a key point here. Another thing that not to be forgotten is that it is at the beginning of August that the Iraqis invade Kuwait. So something else which is going on in the background of this, I mean, you may wonder, what does that have to do with anything? Well, everything has to do with everything in one way or the other. But there's a crisis brewing in the Middle East. And that, of course, is then going to start with the Iraqi invasion and annexation of Kuwait, and then that will lead to Operation Desert Storm and the kind of Cold War with Iraq that will then continue for the next decade. So there's some things going on behind there. And I don't think it incidental, later on I'll bring in why, that a major crisis in the Middle East is brewing while these events are going on in Germany and in Florida. What could be the possible connection? So, let's start out by talking about who are the Gulf Breeze Six. You know, it's not what is the Gulf Breeze Six, but who are the Gulf Breeze Six? Well, they are, in the summer of 1990, 6 U.S. Army intelligence analysts who were working in Germany, in the southern state of Bavaria, at a thing called the Augsburg Station. Now, the Augsburg Station is actually a little way, you have to get it on a map to get a reference here, but, find Germany, find Munich, it's down at the bottom, and then look a little bit north and you'll find Augsburg. And the Augsburg Station is a listening station. It is managed, in fact, it's actually run by the NSA, the National Security Agency.
Oh, really?
Yes, because they handle all the signals intelligence. But the personnel who work there, at least the grunts, are Army. Mm. That is not unusual. There are lots of Army people who work in and around with the NSA. And it's actually located in a little town just outside of Augsburg called Gablingen, if you want to get precise. And what it is that if you looked at it, what you would see would be a large circular 30-foot wire fence. Sometimes that's called the elephant cage. But what that actually is a Wühlenweber. Yes, it was designed by Germans, by Nazis. A Wühlenweber antenna array, a large circular antenna which just picks up signals intelligence. Mm. So keep in mind, the NSA, the National Security Agency, is specifically a signals intelligence. They listen on your phone, whatever. They listen to things. They are massive eavesdropping. Is essentially what this is all about. And this is what the Augsburg Station is. It is an eavesdropping station, an electronic eavesdropping station that has, since the 1970s, monitored Eastern Bloc, most importantly, Soviet transmissions. And there are people there. There are people who look for Morse interpreters, non-Morse interpreters. Apparently, most of the people that we're going to be talking about, at least as I've seen, were classified in their military MOS as 98 kilos, or at least some of them were.
What's
98K? That is a non-Morse interpreter. So, in other words, they're all, I think what that means is they're generally dealing with voice communications. So they listen in.
So they're transcribing maybe or something?
Well, let's go who these people are first.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about 6 people. 2 will be talked about for the most part. And they are the 2 oldest. So they are, the oldest of the lot is 26, and that is a guy named Ken Beeson. And in 1990, he is a specialist, essentially the equivalent of a corporal, an E4, kind of junior NCO. The other, a year younger, 25, certainly the most talkative of the group, the one whose name is going to come up the most because his mouth runs the most, is Vance Davis. He is also a specialist. So Davis and Beeson are about the same age. They have the same rank. They apparently have the same MOS. Then the next is the one woman in the group. So this group of 6 consists of 5 men and 1 woman. She is 22-year-old Annette Eccleston. She is the sergeant. She actually has the highest rank within this group. And then the other three, Michael Huckstadt, I'm going to Americanize his name. He's an American, but he has a very German name, which looks like Huckstadt, but we'll just call him Huckstadt. Michael Huckstadt from Wyoming, Chris Perlock, and William Bill Setterberg. They are respectively 19, 20, and 20.
Okay.
So you got a group of three somewhat older people and three younger. They are PFCs. Now, one of the things they have in common is that they all were trained in Pensacola, Florida. Okay. Now, Pensacola, got to know your Florida geography, is down. It's almost dangerously close to Alabama. It is the site of the Pensacola Naval Air Station, but it is also the site of something called Corey Station. And Corey Station is run by the U.S. Navy, but people from all branches of the service are trained there in information warfare intelligence.
PSYOPs?
Well, this is where you're trained to do the job. You know, you're trained to be 98 kilos and listen in for a variety of things.
Okay.
But the Navy run Corey Station is the Center for Information Warfare Training. That name changes over time, and this is one of the problems I've had with this because the U.S. Army, bless its heart, constantly changes things. So remember, in talking about what the terms were that were used in 1990 are not in every case, in many cases, the same that were used today or somewhat earlier. So there's always a kind of adjustment of this. So the Center for Information Warfare Training, this is essentially where members, presumably highly qualified members of the U.S. Armed Forces, are taken to be trained as warriors of the airwaves, the eavesdroppers supreme.
An InfoWar?
InfoWars. The other thing that all of these six have in common is that they are also rated ST, which means they are skilled technicians.
Okay.
So basically, this seems to be the way that it started. You know, they went in, they signed up. You know, you take your intelligence test, essentially, and before you're assigned your actual occupation, your MOS, there's a kind of general area where you're going to go. And so skilled technician seems to be a kind of leader or title that they would have. This one of the things that means is that they were rated as being smart, among the most intelligent of enlistees, and therefore they would be trained for this highly technical job that requires a certain amount of intelligence and judgment, actually a fair amount of it. So these are not your average GIs. They are theoretically supposed to be the smartest of the crop that comes in. I want you to keep that in mind as we go further with this in terms of certain decisions that are made where you might ask yourself, would a reasonably intelligent person do this? So, these are supposed to be the smart ones, which isn't to argue that they're not, but we shall see. Sometimes smart people make stupid decisions. And sometimes the other way around. Now, so you got these six. Remember, Davis, Beeson, Annette Eccleston, the lone female, and then the three privates, Setterberg, Perlock, and Huckstadt. And they seem to work together. One of the things that I haven't been able to determine is to whether they're part of a functioning team. That is, did they work shifts together, or did they simply know each other? Were they part of the crew of other people? There were many other people who worked at the Augsburg station. But they all became acquainted, apparently, through their broad common interest in two things. One was religion. It appears that later, at least, they will all describe themselves, or they will be described, there's a difference in that, as devout Christians. Some of them are. There's a whole question here. You have to be very careful in terms of what you can find that someone actually said, what comes out of their mouth, and what someone says that they said. Sometimes those can be the same thing. Sometimes they can be quite different. But they all appear to have an interest in religion. They generally or wholly identify as Christians. And as a result of that, they've been engaged in Bible study. And their attention had focused primarily on the most fascinating part of the Bible, the book of Revelation. Because remember, that supposedly got all the secrets. And then, Revelation, the end times, the second coming, the rapture will play a role in this. So just in case you're wondering whether or not Jesus is going to show up and there's going to be a rapture, maybe didn't happen, but that will be an issue.
Do we know what kind of Christians they were? Because if they're talking about Revelation, and it's the U.S. Army.
Well, one person who's a friend of Beeson, bringing up again, a guy by the name of Stan Johnson, will later say that as far as he could tell, their ideas seem to focus around fundamentalist Baptist theology combined with the paranormal and UFOs.
Okay.
Now, how do those things work together? Hang on. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but we'll see if we can figure this out. So they're interested. They have a religious interest in the Bible. They've been looking at the book of Revelation. But they also, all or most of them, have some interest in what could be called the paranormal. Now, it's right away. Well, there's some particular things about a couple of them, but I'll come back to this. So first, I want to kind of generally sketch out what happened. So they're interested in the Bible, they're interested in the paranormal, and they're interested in the paranormal after experimenting with things like one story, which apparently comes out of one of their mouths, is that, well, we started testing things out, like, tarot cards, for instance. We wanted to try to do some of this stuff in ESP, and we couldn't get anything out. It might have been, there's an implication that maybe from a Christian standpoint, they were trying to test this in order to disprove it. But they didn't have any luck. They got nothing out of it until one guy, I think it's Chris Perlock, decided to go out and buy a Ouija board. And once the Ouija board comes onto the scene, things begin to change. Because there, they immediately begin making lively contact with various spirits.
Seems out of character for the Baptists that I know, because a Ouija board is foreboding.
The work of the devil.
Yeah.
Well, there is also the story that they decided to protect, they were scientists. See, they wanted to explore this. So they were going to use the Ouija board, but how, as a good Christian, could you use a Ouija board? Well, you say a prayer before you start using it. Oh. And the idea is that will protect us.
Okay.
And at one point, the main spirit that will appear, the guiding spirit is called Sapphire.
Mm. Why
Sapphire? Because that's what it calls itself. And Sapphire becomes their kind of guide, the sort of spirit guide that it, and they do give Sapphire a test. And the test was, they asked Sapphire, who is Lord? Now, there are two versions of what the reply is. One is that Jesus is Lord. Okay. The other is that God is Lord. Now, as some purists might notice, what the Spirit did not say is that Jesus is my Lord. So any self-respecting demon can say Jesus is Lord because, well, that's true, but not necessarily mine. So should that have been a tip-off? I don't know. But they try to protect them. So they're using the Ouija board. Sapphire comes on, and then Sapphire will bring in other spirits. Now, I have to add here that this sounds kind of familiar to me because when I was a teenager, I had a group of friends of almost exactly the same number, and we played around with the Ouija board. And we never had a spirit named Sapphire, but you did find that one would sort of lead you to another that would come along. And they get some interesting ones. So not too long, probably because of their religious inclinations. The other spirits that Sapphire would bring onto the board to talk to them were the prophet Zechariah and the apostles Mark and Timothy. Or at least they were spirits named Zechariah, Mark, and Timothy, and they assumed that that's who they were. And certainly they had to be okay. And if that's not enough, eventually the Virgin Mary shows up. I don't know anybody who's ever used the Ouija board who's got the Virgin Mary to come through. And this, apparently they become increasingly convinced about this. But there's also, now here's one of the things that right away would give me serious pause. Mm. You're talking to a spirit that claims to be the Virgin Mary on a Ouija board. And the Virgin Mary asks, well, essentially says, I am the Blessed Virgin Mary. How many personnel are currently occupying your listening station in Germany?
Wow.
Okay. And in fact, there are two different versions of this. One is that this on the Ouija board, but another one said that no, it wasn't the Ouija board. It was a disembodied voice that just appeared in the room.
Please give me critical intelligence about it.
So this is where I have to wonder if these people are trained intelligence analysts, and certainly at some point in their training, they were warned about things, particularly about people who show up asking you questions about where you work and what you do and how many people are there. So wouldn't that raise something? Why would the Virgin Mary need to know how many people were working at the Augsburg NSA listening station?
It's just amazing to me that if they made this up, that it's the Virgin Mary who's asking these sensitive questions, or someone is spoofing the Virgin Mary through a Ouija board, which is also
that's
fantastic.
Easy enough to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's the entities that appear through Ouija boards, even if you want to assume that they actually exist, can essentially say they're anyone.
Right.
You don't know. Of course, that's the same time everybody something says it's an angel appears to someone and goes, I'm an angel. And, people just somehow accept that. Because why not? But maybe you should ask more questions. Right there, I would think that would have stopped them. They should have gone to higher, that something else is going on here that's not normal. Assuming this incident actually happens. But, it said that it happened, so let's go with that. So, through the efforts of the Virgin Mary and Sapphire, they're also at some point... Now, these Ouija board sessions go on for several months. Now, here right away is an interesting question. When did they begin and how many sessions are there? Usually in later statements, they say there were 7 Ouija board sessions. They took copious notes. In fact, in excess of 1,500 pages of notes. That's a lot. All of which, by the way, except for 200 pages, have since disappeared. The army took the rest, supposedly.
Interesting.
So they took 1,500 pages of notes. They're writing all of this stuff down. Notes about what? Well, we don't really know. One version, and what I'm mostly going by here, are statements that are accounted to various people in press reports. It said that Perlock purchased the Ouija board, I think in one case it's May 1989. In another case it's May 1988. 88 sounds too early, so I'm going to assume they actually mean 89. But then in all the other cases, it doesn't appear that they began seriously using it until November or December of 1989. So remember, we're leading up to these events in July of 1990. So it's important to know what the time frame. So this was something... There were 7 or 8 main Ouija board sessions over a period of several months. That much seems to be the case, which resulted in huge amounts of notes being taken. And the basic message they seem to be getting from Sapphire and the others is that there's some huge cataclysm coming. The Earth is going to face cataclysms. And the scale of cataclysms sounded very similar or even exactly in the concept of the Christian tribulations, the end of times. Yeah. So there's going to be this huge cataclysm which is going to take place. Now, I have to say here that in the general history of ufology and contactees and UFO religions going back to the 1950s, the concept of an impending catastrophe, some sort of almost a world-ending event, which the Space Brothers will save us from, goes back to the early 1950s. And one of the first places you can find this is in 1954, 55, with a group around Detroit, Michigan, the Michigan-Chicago area, called the Seekers. And this is where a woman by the name of Dorothy Martin began to channel, what else? Aliens, spirits, and they told her that, yes, the U.S. is going to be wiped out by earthquakes and tidal waves, or at least Chicago is, and we're going to send a fleet of flying saucers, and you, the faithful, will be picked up and carried away. Now, keep in mind, that story roughly matches concepts of the rapture, which is that those who are good with Jesus will, before the tribulations take place, all be beamed aboard heaven, or they will be taken off. There's a video game about this. This has come up again. People think that the rapture is going to occur. There was someone who just predicted that sometime in the last year. It didn't occur again. But this is a common theme within the UFO sphere, and it combines with its Christian end of times theology. So if you hold one belief, it's pretty easy to take the others. Well, something else they're told to do in the midst of this is that they're told to go to Munich, which isn't that far away, and to find a woman called Gabrielle. And apparently they're given other indication, and they find Gabrielle. And Gabrielle is apparently a German woman, and she is connected with a thing called Ashtar Command.
That doesn't sound German.
No. An Ashtar Command, again, goes back to the American UFO contactee milieu of the 1950s. Okay. And in fact, the first place that you hear about Commander Ashtar and the Ashtar Command is from a guy that we'll be talking about in a future episode. So these contactees, Adamski, Van Tassel, and the rest, we may take up next or very soon. So it's a little teaser for what's going to come. But George Van Tassel was an early American contactee who lived out in the Mojave Desert under a giant rock and who held channeling sessions where he channeled various aliens. I mean, are they spirits or aliens? Okay, you're channeling them. They're both. They're alien spirits. They're spirit aliens. And one of them was called Ashtar, who was he was a Captain Kirk. That's what he was. He was a Captain Kirk from either the Pleiades or Alpha Centauri. I think at one point he's described as a Venusian, somewhere in space.
But these are the Nordics, right?
Yes, I think he's usually described as a tall, blonde surfer.
That's
a surfing William Shatner from Alpha Centauri.
Did that image of the Venusian or whatever originate with Adamski, or is that older?
I think it's older. I think a lot of this stuff seems to go back, this is a digression, to a thing called the I Am movement.
Okay.
In the 1930s, it was a kind of, it was another one of these kind of adaptations, or shall we say rip-offs of theosophy.
Okay.
In which you've got the ascended masters who, in this case, this is a case where the head of it, Guy Ballard, talks about meeting Venusians on Mount Shasta. Okay, so you got Venusians, you got Mount Shasta, you got the ascended masters. Okay. And so much of this stuff then gets recycled into the 50s saucer milieu, into the contactee, the people who think they're either physically or psychically in contact with aliens. So Ashtar seems to be a term that first comes up with George Van Tassel in 1952, and then it gets picked up in a variety of different ways, and there's a kind of gradual evolution of it. And what I was interested in is that, okay, there's this name Ashtar Command. There's something I could kind of sink my teeth into. So where would this woman in Germany come in contact with Ashtar Command in the late 1980s or early 1990s? So Van Tassel, very roughly, formed a thing called the Ministry of Universal Wisdom. And that was his kind of imprint to produce a variety, mostly of pamphlets and other works, who talked about his channeling of Ashtar. And of course, the Space Brothers, as we know from the contactees, like Van Tassel, only want to come and help us and stop us from blowing ourselves up with atom bombs.
Let's take the nukes, yeah.
They never otherwise provide a shred of technical advice. They never give us any nifty gadgets.
Yeah.
But they're always going to save us from ourselves and from some kind of impending atomic or natural catastrophe. So again, that idea has been around in the UFO sphere for decades before this appears. And then Ashtar became such a popular figure that other contactees, like the Reverend Robert Short, again, a Christian minister who was also channeling aliens, he would talk about Ashtar. And then in the 1970s, there's a woman by the name of Thelma Terrell who renamed herself Tuella.
Oh, nice.
Probably because the spirit told her to. She was the one who would actually, I think, coin the term the Ashtar Galactic Command.
Okay.
And this is what Ashtar, who also gets a last name in the process. He becomes Commander Ashtar Sharan for some reason.
It was like Valiant Thor.
Yeah, so like Valiant Thor. Okay. So he's commanding a whole fleet of starships. And Thelma Terrell, Tuella, also says that Ashtar Galactic Command, there's going to be a catastrophe, and that Commander Ashtar and his fleet of starships will show up to save those who are worthy, those who are in the know. So this is in the late 1970s. By the early 1980s, she and other people have picked up on a thing called Project World Evacuation. So again, there's going to be, well, kind of end of the world.
Yeah.
And the righteous or the alien loving will be picked up and rescued. And there need to be people, Earthlings recruited, they're going to help with this evacuation. I don't know exactly what you're going to do, help people stand in line, hand out water, whatever it is. But the world is going to end. Commander Ashtar and the Galactic Command are going to come and save us. And this is all being actively promoted in certain circles by 1982. And then in 1986, just a few years before that, another woman, a psychic by the name of Yvonne Cole, directly warns again that there's going to be a catastrophe that will effectively destroy the Earth in 1994, and Ashtar Command will come and save us. So I think there's a connection between this. Remember, they're being told by Sapphire that the world is going to end. There are going to be all these catastrophes. You have been chosen to be part of the salvation of at least some portion of humanity. You're going to play some kind of role in this. And they're told to go contact a woman who's connected to Ashtar Command. So I think that's where these ideas are coming from. So what we've got here seemingly is a combination of the Christian rapture with alien rescue, which actually becomes, those two things seem to fit together pretty well. So the other thing they get, what really seems, the question might be, is that why are these people who, again, are supposed to be Army skilled technicians, intelligent, why are they taken in by this? Or why are they so convinced? Well, something else that Sapphire and the other spirits are giving them are prophecies. They give them predictions. Supposedly there's a list of 100 of them. And there are all of these various predictions. And I haven't seen all 100 of them, but a lot of them are, they're kind of vague. The one that seems to make a big impression. Well, here's a case. At some point, they want to know where they should go. We'll come back. They're told that you need to leave Germany. Well, where should we go? Maybe we should go to California. No, you don't want to go to California because there's going to be there's going to be a 14.6 magnitude earthquake. The Richter scale doesn't even go that high. Okay. But I guess, there's going to be a 14.6 magnitude. So you don't want to go there. You don't want to go to Seattle because Mount Rainier is going to explode. So, and this huge earthquake in California is going to occur in 1996. It didn't. at least not in our time frame.
Yeah.
But some people argue that, well, there was a big earthquake, a 6.7 magnitude earthquake in California in 1994. So you see, the prophecy was
close.
Yeah. That all depends what you define as close. Now, personally, I'm more picky in that. That's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're told there's going to be a 14.6 magnitude earthquake in 1996 to fulfill the prophecy, I would say that has to happen. If it's a lesser earthquake that happens 2 years earlier than the Whiskey, that's not too helpful. Then I don't know. I think you're stretching. I think you're trying to reach for anything there. But, one would get an argument about that. But my argument is that just doesn't quite seem to mesh. But one thing that did get their attention, well, there were two things that really got their attention. One, which actually happened, was a prediction that there was going to be an earthquake in Iran. And in early 1990, there was a very bad earthquake in Iran. Maybe killed 30 to 50,000 people, possibly more. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that seemed to be a workout. And then they were told there's a crisis brewing in the Middle East. And remember, this crisis does begin brewing in the Middle East. But the other thing they were told is that beginning in 1995, the Army is going to start marking soldiers. The mark of the beast. Mm. They're going to put implants in you, and you want to avoid this. You have to get out of the Army before then. You don't want to get the mark of the beast.
I don't know why this didn't occur earlier, but 1990, what book comes out? Is it 90 or 91? Is Behold a Pale Horse.
Yes. Okay.
Right? So,
William Cooper is going to.
Okay.
Because guess what book they read? Behold a Pale Horse. So they start reading William Cooper, and he's one of the guys supposedly they want to meet when they come to the U.S.
Interesting.
So yes, William Cooper and Behold a Pale Horse will show up. So this is all fitting into. So they become increasingly convinced of this. So the prophecies overall are kind of hit or miss. Most of them don't materialize, but is often with these things, all you have to do is get one or two things. Yeah. And people will tend to ignore the other ones that don't happen. So they become seemingly, whatever their training, whatever the wits that they had about them, convinced that this is true and that they're going to have to leave Germany. And this is when Sapphire and the others go, well, you just need to leave. Okay. Apparently there was some effort to try to get out of the Army. Can we end our enlistments? No, just go. Well, that would mean going AWOL or deserting. We'll just do it anyway, because that's what the Ouija board spirits tell you to do. Destroy your entire career and possibly end up spending years in a military prison. Because again, these guys have a highly sensitive position. The Army was quite aware of that.
Oh, I imagine going AWOL when you're a intelligence specialist is probably worse.
Well, one of the things the Army would later admit is that all of them had information that could be extremely valuable to a potential adversary.
Yeah.
So, how this place worked. Now, you would assume that if this was all, you might already be suspecting, well, this is some kind of Russian psyop. This is what all of this is about. Okay. First of all, you've got, they've caught on that somehow or another these people are susceptible to these ideas, and through some, really sneaky commie means, they figured out a way to actually, how do you control the Ouija board? I don't know, but remember, these are Russians.
Well, there's projection of thought, like voices into people's heads. They were doing experiments with that stuff as far back as MK Ultra.
And that can be done.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd give an example of that. Another slight digression. There's a fellow who may have come up in previous episodes and will definitely come up again, a kind of contract scientist for the U.S. military and the CIA from the 50s all the way through the 70s by the name of Andrija Puharich. And Puharich essentially believed that the brain was both a transmitter and a receiver. It was like a radio. And so he did a great deal of experimentation on that. And one of the things that he did, he actually for a while worked for what was essentially a hearing aid company. And he found that he could install a small radio receiver and transmitter into one of your back molars. And that could, in a person who was otherwise deaf, sort of transmit sound and voices. You could talk to them via radio, and this would go directly into their head, and they would hear the voice.
Interesting.
So, can somebody put some tiny little thing in your head that will make you hear voices? Yes. Okay. And that was already around in the late 1950s. So that technology was there. It would require, some dental work, but that wouldn't be too hard to take care of.
But if that was in the 50s, that would be, this is speculation, would be, you got 30, 40 years on top of that, right? So maybe. Just throwing it out there.
What I would, the first thing that I would suspect, given my natural suspicion, is that this is some kind of Russian psychological operation and they're messing with these people's heads. But if it was, and this is where, go see Gabrielle in Munich and she'll give you more information. All right. All you have to do is Gabrielle in Munich. And then the Virgin Mary asking about staffing at the station. But then you would assume what would, if Sapphire was a Russian spirit, they would tell them, go east, go somewhere. They wouldn't tell them, no, there's the one place you're going to go. You don't want to go to California. You don't want to go to Seattle. You want to go to Gulf Breeze, Florida. That's where you've got to go because there are big events that are going to happen there. And part of that is because there'd been this recent UFO sightings. Yeah. And in fact, there've been lots of them between 1987 and 1991. There was something like 200 UFO sightings in and around Pensacola. So Gulf Breeze is a small town at the tip of a spit of land right across Pensacola Bay from Pensacola, where Corus Station is, where the Pensacola Air Base is. And then also just a little ways to the east is Eglin Air Force Base, which is also a highly sensitive area. So this is the whole Pensacola area is heavily militarized. There are Air Force and Navy installations. There's even a Coast Guard base there as well. And of course, this information warfare training school. So what I would assume is that if this was a Russian operation, they wouldn't send them to Pensacola, Florida, probably, unless there was some, why are they all going back to the area where they had been trained? So remember, all of them had been there before. And they knew some people there, and we'll come back to those. So, rough story from this point is that they desert.
Okay.
They all leave. They go to Munich. They get on a plane. They come to the States. We'll come back as to when they leave and how they get to the States, because that's also unclear for a variety of reasons. But they're certainly back stateside by the 5th or 6th of July. And in fact, we know that two of them, Ken Beeson, the eldest member of this, and I think Mike Huckstadt, one of the privates, they're picked up by a friend in Knoxville. So Beeson is from Tennessee. He has his friend Stan Johnson come and pick them up at the Knoxville airport. Now, that's interesting because there are no direct flights that I can determine between Munich and Knoxville, which means they had to fly into somewhere else first and then fly to Knoxville. So where were they in between? Those little details become important. And at that point, Johnson first drives them to the nearby town of Talbot, where Beeson's sister lives. And so he visits with his sister. And he explained, she's of course wondering, well, why are you here? And he's saying, well, we had to leave Germany. And both in the case of Johnson and Beeson's sister, I think her name was something like Carolyn Reed, they later give statements, and this is what they say Beeson told them. Remember, this isn't what he said, we know, but this is what they say he said. That they had been instructed to come, that Jesus was going to return in a flying saucer at Gulf Breeze, that the rapture was coming down and that they had to be, this was going to be on the 6th of August, and they needed to be on the beach in Gulf Breeze to wait for Jesus in his flying saucer, or they would miss the rapture. And the Antichrist is also going to try to show up and do this, and possibly will kill him. Okay, so this is where you see these, and this got picked up in elements of the press, that they came there to to meet Jesus and kill the Antichrist. Now, subsequently, Beeson and the others will say, we never said anything about that. And they go, why, Jesus doesn't need a flying saucer.
Yeah.
Okay. Jesus, he didn't need a flying saucer before. He doesn't need one now. That's just stupid, which maybe arguably it is. But now, my question here is, you've got two different people who have no particular reason to lie about what they heard, and I'm not quite sure how they could have gotten that confused. So I would maybe I'm unreasonably, I would just suspect that Beeson actually did say something about that when he was talking to his sister and his friend. Maybe they added some things to it, but you've got a couple of people who can say that we sort of heard the same thing this guy's saying, even though he now denies that he said it. So the two of them, Beeson and the other, are in Knoxville on the 6th. The next day, Johnson drives them, it takes them to buy a Volkswagen van, a hippie van. Now, there's a certain problem with the van. It has a broken taillight. So they go to the auto parts store and they spend $30 fixing the taillight. That is specifically mentioned. The taillight was out. We fixed it. Then they drive in the van down to Chattanooga, which isn't too far, and they meet the other four. Eccleston, Davis, and the other two privates. So they're all unified. And here's my whole question about this. How did they all travel together initially? At what point did they become separated into a group of 2 and 4? There's another article, actually going back to, again, Davis is the most talkative of this, from around 1992, where Davis says, we actually left Munich on the 3rd of July. And we flew from Munich to Atlanta. Now, that makes some sense. I don't know what airline schedules were in 1990. If you look at that today, you could go to Munich and you could find a few direct flights to Atlanta. Most of them, however, have one stopover, and those stopovers are either in Frankfurt or they're in Paris. But it's feasible you could have gotten there. But if they were supposed to go to Gulf Breeze and they landed in Atlanta, why did they then fly north to Knoxville? Because they're going in the opposite direction. Gulf Breeze is south. Fairly simple. So instead, why are they up in Knoxville and Chattanooga? What would be the point of that? Now, in Beeson's case, it could be that he specifically went there to see his sister. I can't think of any other reason he would be in Knoxville. Gets there, goes and sees his sister, comes back to Chattanooga. They've all not gone in the direction of Gulf Breeze. And they are also supposedly told something else. Remember, I've emphasized supposedly. Sapphire, or one of the spirits, told them, when you get to the States and go to Gulf Breeze, you need to be out of there and head further west by the 6th. You need to leave town by the 6th. Now, where are they supposed to go? New Mexico. And then once they got to New Mexico, they would meet other people and they would get information, and they were then going to go into the mountains somewhere in New Mexico or Arizona to ride out the cataclysm until the time was right. So apparently they weren't going to hang around on the beach waiting for Jesus in a flying saucer. They were going to head off into the wilds of the Southwest. Kind of William Cooper country.
Yeah.
I begin to think about it.
Was he there always? I thought he was. I don't know if he was.
I don't know whether he was there.
I know he died.
Yeah.
He died kind of.
But remember this. All weird things happen in the Southwest, so that's where they're going. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking Arizona, New Mexico, and then where's Van Tassel or Adamski? He's So
They're in the desert.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, Adamski's over near the beach in California, but it's close to the desert because
Yeah.
nothing in California is that far away from it. And Van Tassel's living under a giant rock
Yeah.
in the desert
Yeah.
in California.
Okay.
So the American Southwest, the heart of psychic darkness of the whole country. So naturally, they're going to go there. Well, they don't. So they all then roll down in their hippie van into Gulf Breeze, and they go to the home of a woman named Anna Foster. Now, Anna Foster was a local psychic, and she worked in the New Age bookstore because she had to work in the New Age bookstore. And she had met Beeson and one of the others back at Chris Perlock, when they were training at Camp Corey, because apparently they'd frequented. Now, Beeson, by the way, had an interest in hypnotism and the paranormal and UFOs. He'd always kind of had that. So that would probably be why he would go in to the New Age bookstore, where she was also a psychic and a crystal person, whatever you do. She was very much into crystals and to reading people's minds, or she was a Russian agent specifically there to cultivate people going to the Naval Information Warfare Training School, because there was someone there. Okay.
Well, I told you, Steve Bannon, who was a Navy guy, that was his thing. It's like, oh, I know where all the best New Age occult bookstores are for, I forgot where in the world it was. I feel like it was Asia, but maybe it wasn't. But still, just there's that connection where there's folks in the service who are interested.
So the implication is that Anna Foster and Beeson, one thing mentions that they had met in 1989, which means that might have been him when he was there. He could have met her, and that they had some kind of romance going on. There was something between the two of them. So kind of going to his girlfriend's place. She is a single mom, divorced. She also has a roommate named Iris Gautier. Remember that as well, because Iris Gautier will also subsequently end up married to another one of these guys. Okay? So, now, what else is Anna Foster doing besides dealing with crystals and working in a New Age bookstore and giving psychic readings? She's also a member of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network.
Okay.
Now let's throw one more thing into it. Remember I said that in the couple of years preceding, this local guy, Ed Walters, had claimed to have had contact with aliens, that they had, paralyzed him with a blue beam. He'd kind of contact with aliens 19 times. And this was the whole Gulf Breeze UFO incident. There was, of course, a great deal of criticism of his accounts, that it was another hoax, which was that suspicion being significantly aided by the discovery of a styrofoam saucer, basically built out of styrofoam paper plates, that was found in the attic of the house he'd been living in by the next people that moved in, which looked exactly like the pictures that he'd taken of the flying saucer before. Now, Anna Foster was friends with Ed Walters' daughter. She's a member of MUFON. She's into flying saucers. I think in addition to crystals and psychic readings, she's much into that. And here's the interesting thing. MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, was holding its annual meeting in Gulf Breeze at the very same time.
Okay.
So between the 6th and the 8th of August, it was the 1990 MUFON conference.
This is too good.
So one of the questions becomes, all right, so we know that they picked up the van on the 7th, and they must have driven down. So they would have gotten to Gulf Breeze probably on maybe the same day, at least the last day or so of the MUFON conference. Did any of them attend? Did any of the Gulf Breeze 6 show up? Well, there's no record of them showing up any of the sessions, but Anna Foster did. She was there. Now, one of the other things that was interesting about this 1990 MUFON convention is that it followed on the heels of the 1989 MUFON convention. I'm not sure where that was, where a very prominent figure in ufology by the name of Bill Moore got up and gave a shocking speech. He admitted that he had, for years, been a disinformation agent for the U.S. Air Force, that he had worked with Air Force intelligence to spread false stories.
Is this a Doty affiliate?
Yes, Doty is part of this the whole disinformation campaign, and this was a huge shock because he had been a fairly respected figure, and now he's got I've been working with the Air Force to lead you astray, and probably other people have been doing that as well. So there was this. So this was the conference that followed it. It had about 800 attendees, and people were still kind of reeling from that as well. So that's an interesting idea. So one idea is that these guys were all being sent in to sort of infiltrate the MUFON conference. I'm not sure exactly for what purpose or to monitor what was going on. They arrived kind of late for these things to happen, but they are there, at least at the tail end, where that's going on. And this is not one of these cases where you're looking at all these different elements and you have to figure out which of these things are important and which of them are just incidental. And I can't claim to know exactly. I think it's probably not just accidental that there was a UFO conference going on in Gulf Breeze when these guys showed up, wanting to meet Jesus in a flying saucer, maybe or maybe not, but all of these things come together. So they didn't leave on the 6th, as Sapphire had told them to. In fact, they hang around for several days doing what? It isn't entirely clear. And then on the 13th of... Now, I should go back just a little bit here because there's, in terms of the chronology... Remember, Davis would later say that they flew out of Munich. By they, I don't know whether he meant he and Huckstadt or all 6 of them. Did they all fly out together?
Doesn't sound like it.
Also comes up a question, how did they manage to do this? They forged leave papers.
Okay.
Which means they could get a hold of the papers. Now, keep in mind, this is 1990, so it's kind of pre-digital, so there were actual papers. But if you're traveling around, you have to have documentation signed by your superiors saying that you are doing and you are where you're supposed to be. So they had to get a hold of the forms, and then they had to forge signatures on them, which is a fairly serious offense.
Yeah.
In addition to just going AWOL. Or desertion, depending how you want to treat it in this case. Now, if they left Munich on the 3rd, and then they fly into Knoxville, at least 2 of them, on the 6th, then where were they in between? That isn't clear to me. Now, something that does come into this, though, is that there's another date. Wednesday, July 4th. Okay, so the 4th of July is a holiday. It's a federal holiday. It's a holiday for military people. And in this case, July 4th fell in the middle of the week, followed by a Thursday and a Friday, and then a weekend. And there is the natural tendency for people who could arrange leave or otherwise to make it into a long weekend. So one of the things I think plays a role into this is the July 4th holiday, which is going to throw all kinds of schedules out of sync. So they might have left. I mean, my guess would be that they left on the 5th, that they flew out, that, they sort of took advantage of the July 4th, even though they didn't have orders. It wouldn't have been unusual for a lot of people to be traveling, the things to come up, because it's just going to throw off the kind of regular rotation. Although remember, Augsburg Station was staffed 24 hours a day. What I don't know is whether all of these 6 worked together. Would they all have been there in the same shift, or did they work in different teams on different shifts? My suspicion is they were probably working together because it would make it much easier for them to be away. They aren't noticed. They are not reported being AWOL until the morning of Monday the 9th. So the whole long 4th of July weekend, it would again seem to me, was deliberately chosen as a time for them to make their escape because they could be reasonably certain that they wouldn't be missed until the morning. So on the 9th, they're reported AWOL. Army has no idea where these guys are. And of course, they begin looking for them. Now, later on, the Army is very tight-lipped about this whole thing. Those argue that we were never able to figure out how exactly they got to the States. Yes, they were. Okay, certainly they were able to do that. But we're not going to, somehow that information is never disclosed. It's very hazy as to how the travel is, what their route of travel was. So, but the 9th, the Army is looking for them. The 10th, the 11th, the 12th. Then on the 13th, on the evening of the 13th, Mike Huckstad is out driving around in the VW hippie van, and he gets pulled over by the Gulf Breeze cops. Guess why he gets pulled over? He has a faulty tail light. The same tail light that they had repaired before. Also, someone mentioned the same tail light that later seemed to work fine. Now, I think many of us have probably had experiences where we might have been pulled over for a faulty taillight. And pulling people over for a faulty taillight is also an excellent, if you can't think of anything else to pull somebody over for, you have a faulty tail. Even if it's working now, it wasn't working when I was looking at it. Yeah. So, was the taillight really faulty or... Anyway, so the cops pull him over for the faulty taillight, do their little check and find out that, the Army wants this guy for being AWOL. So he's taken into custody in the evening. It's not until the next morning of the 14th that Army security personnel with guns drawn descend on Anna Foster's house and arrest the other 4 except for Anna Eccleston, who for some reason is the one who's not staying at the house. No, she's camping in a tent in a nearby state park. Why? I don't know. There's a reason why that's the, she didn't like, there's some sort of tension between her and Anna Foster. It couldn't be because there wasn't enough room. It couldn't be because, she was the only woman with 5 guys before. Now there are 2 more women around. So that is another sort of odd thing. But on the 14th, they're all picked up. It is, by one description, not a nice, simple arrest where they come in and go, well, you're AWOL, you need to come with us. No, this is bursting in with guns drawn, down on the ground, guns held to their head, handcuffed, pulled into a van, and driven off to Fort Benning.
Wow.
Where 2 of them, I don't know which 2, are temporarily held in the psych ward. The others are all held in solitary confinement, again, according to one description, not allowed to talk to each other. And so that's probably around the 15th or the 16th. Then they're carted off to Fort Knox, and that is where the judicial proceedings are supposed to happen. They are initially charged with desertion, which is a much more serious charge than away without leave, and also forging leave papers. That would mean a court-martial, and if convicted, it would have almost certainly have meant a number of years in a military prison. However, sometime around the 24th or 25th, it isn't clear, the military decides to proceed with no judicial action. Court-martial does not take place. The desertion charge is dropped. They are demoted in rank. They forfeit half a month's pay, and they are given a general discharge. And on the 27th of July, they are out of the Army.
Wow.
The general discharges, now this also, sometimes they say we got an honorable discharge. All the early references clearly state it was a general discharge. And that sounds about right. But as is often the case, general discharges can be appealed and upgraded to an honorable discharge, which appears to be what happened in all or most of the cases. So they got off very easy.
Can I
Sure.
interject? I have a friend who was discharged for, it was a drug-related thing, and it was other than honorable, right? Nothing egregious. It was, I think, your typical, a drug offense. Definitely not as severe as this. And so to be honorably discharged eventually seems odd, like something was. And then when you said the commanding officer, she was out there, right? She was the commander, or she was the highest ranked.
She's the highest rank.
So with her not there while they're being arrested, just, I don't know, makes me think she was involved somehow, and this was, I don't know.
Well, the arrest has a number of questions. One is that you would assume is that what happened is that Hookstadt got picked up. You know, the cops pull him over. They find out he's AWOL. They immediately notify the army, and then he tells them where the other ones are. He denies that he ever told them where any of the other ones were. Is that true? I don't know, but he denies that he ever told them. So how did the army figure out where the other ones were? That has raised an interesting theory, if no more, that the army always knew where they were, that the army had known where they were every moment, that their whole trip and everything they were doing was being monitored. So the whole stunt with the cops pulling over Hookstadt for a burned out taillight was just to provide a pretext as to how they would get him, and then they could arrest the other ones. Where it is they knew where they were. Well, maybe. Some argue that Anna Foster ratted them all out because she'd always somehow been working for the army. That is another kind of possibility. So, I mean, here again is one of these cases to note the difference between the relatively few facts in the case. So the fact in the case is that by the 14th, they were all under arrest. No one disputes that. You can question why they were arrested, how they were arrested, everything else about it, but they were arrested. The other fact in the case is that they were all given a discharge, a general discharge on the 27th without any criminal charges. And why? Now, there's one more thing we can throw into this. The why question might be, is that you'll also, if you look into the case, find that there are claims that after their arrest, but before their release, on the 23rd of July, the Army and also certain media outlets began to receive an anonymous letter, which basically said to free the Gulf Breeze 6. And it argued that we have 500 pages of sensitive UFO documents. Actually, I think it's 500 UFO pictures and documents that can prove that the government has been covering up information about UFOs and their cooperation with aliens. And we will release this to the press unless you immediately cut these guys loose. And that's why 4 days later, they were cut loose. Well, it could be. The one thing that I haven't seen, I've seen reference to this supposed anonymous letter. I haven't seen an original copy of it anywhere. So I don't know whether that's something that occurred, or that's something that somebody fantasized later. Another part of that story is that when this letter showed up, it called at a whole meeting of the National Security Council, and you had President Bush, and you had Colin Powell, and Henry Kissinger was there, and they were all asked, what are we going to do with these guys? They could blow the lid off of our deal with aliens, our whole disclosure. Now they could blow the whole lid off of it. And so we just need to let them go. And it was Colin Powell who insisted that you have to do something to them. Okay. They have to get some kind of repercussion. So you're going to reduce their rank and you're going to cost them a month. You're going to kick them out of the army. So their ranks don't matter anymore. So we won't let them in the army anymore, but they just can't get away with it. Whereas Kissinger supposedly said, no, we must let them go because, okay, we can't mess with the aliens. Ashtar. Anyway, I won't do any further Henry Kissinger impression, but you can imagine the Ashtar command would want this. You know, if you ask me, I think that's bullshit. Okay. I somehow don't think that actually, but you know, it has been alleged. That's all we can see. But this is one of the things that, see, at this point, the bullshit is just flowing around from every corner. All right. This is now you've got, the one thing that you can easily document is that a few days, remember this anonymous letter was supposedly on the 23rd. Now, on the 19th of July, this was not long after they were arrested, when the desertion charges are still pending, Stars and Stripes, the Army's official newspaper, runs the whole article on this. And the Stars and Stripes article mentions the whole thing about, they went there to kill the Antichrist and to meet with Jesus.
Yeah.
These were all, this was all some sort of flying saucer thing. And then subsequently and that's the main way this story then gets, and that's picked up by other papers. And this is generally what you read. These guys were all thought they were going to come and meet Jesus in a flying saucer. Subsequently, the Army retracts that story. They don't say why they're retracting this story, but I guess that's not entirely true.
But it's a good disinfo kind of,
Well, this is what I would see on that. This is soon after the arrest. Yeah. The story that the 6 intelligence analysts had gone AWOL and been arrested. So the Army needs to come up with some kind of story. So you run a column in Stars and Stripes, and what does it paint them at? It paints them
crazy.
As being complete wackos.
Yeah.
Okay, these guys are crazy. You wouldn't believe anything they say, anything that comes out of their mouth. These are people who think they were going to meet. So that to me smacks of pure, deliberate disinformation.
Yeah.
They are at that point being painted as wackos.
Yeah, you poison the well. Yeah.
Right. And then once that's out there, if you retract it, no one is going, the retraction of the story is never noticed as much as the original story to begin with. So after the 27th of July, they're free. So what do? They all head off to Arizona to meet Bill Cooper? No, well, maybe some of them do. Eccleston, the sergeant, and at least 2 of the others, Beeson and one of the privates, they go back to Gulf Breeze. They go back to Anna Foster's house. They just go back to where they'd been picked up. Apparently, so does Vance Davis, although he's not. Now, a guy from MUFON, by the way, is very interested in this because they've mentioned flying saucer. They actually interview them in early August 1990. And even that story is consistent. At one point, the MUFON investigator says, I interviewed 4 of the 6 in Gulf Breeze, but then he says, I interviewed 3. What I think he did is that he interviewed the 3 that were staying at Anna Foster's house, and then he interviewed Vance Davis separately. But they're back in Gulf Breeze by the 4th of August. And a couple of interesting things happen. One of the things that happens is that, according to the local newspaper, on the 16th of August, in Gulf Breeze, Vance Davis takes out a marriage license with Iris Gautier, Anna Foster's roommate, and they get married. And then they move to New Mexico, to Albuquerque.
Oh, God.
Right next to Kirtland Air Force Base.
Okay.
And then he subsequently, in 1992, will come forward and write a book.
Okay.
And in this book, which I think is, it's called Unbroken Promises, a true story of courage and belief. And in the published version of that, he actually has a co-author by a guy by the name of Brian Blashaw. But in the original manuscript, which has the same title, he has 2 co-authors. And those co-authors are Anna Foster and Annette Levesque. Who's Annette Levesque? That's Annette Eccleston. Because if you go back, you find out that for some reason, Annette Eccleston's parents are Marcel and Cecile Levesque from Connecticut. Okay. Why her parents are named Levesque and she is named Eccleston, I don't know.
She's not previously married or something?
Well, I found a newspaper report that in 1984, which mentioned her graduation from boot camp as a private in Alabama.
Okay.
And, the Annette Eccleston, the daughter of Marcel and Cecile Levesque. So maybe she was briefly married at some point. But I would bet you that is her. In fact, I'm damn certain that she's simply gone back. She's simply using the
Yeah.
Levesque name.
Yeah.
So those two initially show up to help Davis write this manuscript, but their name is not on the later version.
Why would somebody do that? Just because the edits don't meet the...
Eccleston seems to have pretty much vanished. It's very difficult to find anything on her in records under either the name Levesque or Eccleston. And most of the other ones have nothing. The guy who talks about it, the only one who gives his account of it, is Vance Davis. Now, one of the reasons he said he decided to do this in 1992 was because of the LA riots. And that was another one of the predictions.
Oh.
And supposedly Sapphire had told them there will be riots in Los Angeles or something like that, however they speak or don't speak. And when those riots occur, this will be a sign that great changes are going to take place and you should come forward and tell your story. So he did. None of the other ones do, except maybe for Annette Levesque Eccleston, who seems to show up and then is there and then is not there. But the other ones have gone just basically quiet. They don't seem to, they want to have anything to do with it, apparently, in this case. So there is some kind of interesting background. I mean, the leader in this, it is very clear to me, it seems clear, is Vance Davis, the second eldest, one of the specialists. And first of all, because there are mentions that he's the guy who gets the whole Bible study going to begin with. Initially, it said that he didn't like the Ouija board, but then got into it. There's also the suggestion that in the Ouija board sessions, that wasn't the only way they were communicating with the spirits, that he was also directly channeling them, just like George Van Tassel under the rock in the Mojave Desert. So, but how much of that is true and how much someone's adding into it? But here's the interesting thing about him. As a teenager, he had taken a course in Silva mind control.
What is this?
Well, it was a guy named Jose Silva who came up with, in the 50s or 60s, a thing called the Silva mind control method. And it was I had heard of it before. It's a form of self-hypnosis. You put yourself into a trance state, a kind of practiced relaxation. And in this trance state, you will boost your intelligence, your confidence. You can increase people tend to take these courses because they thought it enhanced their learning skills. It helped you get into college, pass calculus. But it's self-hypnosis, fairly, self-induced transcendental meditation, maybe in some sort of way. But Silva mind control. But that's also about the same time that he mentions in this book, that he began to receive visitations from a spirit named Kia. And Kia was a spirit, an alien, possibly, and Kia helped him cure his flat-footedness.
Wow.
She performed some kind of psychic surgery on his feet, and they were okay. And that later, of course, helped him to get into the military. And she had also told him that there were great things. He was going to play a great role in things that would happen in the future. And so one of the things that certainly was implied in this is that later on, the spirit Sapphire from the Ouija board told him things that jived with what his previous spirit friend Kia had told him. And that then increased his confidence that this was true. Or it's all just another bullshit story that he made up. Because remember, we're just taking people's word for these things. But Davis seems to be the ringleader. And the thing to notice in this is that the Sergeant Eccleston seems to be playing absolutely no leadership role in this whatsoever.
Yeah.
She's just, going along with that. She was also one of those people who would have to, in her case, her signature would have been on there, but she's adding her signature to, assuming she is their immediate superior, to these falsified leave papers. So that, as best I can put it together, is the basic story of the Gulf Breeze 6. And so it brings us back to the question, what the hell was going on? If it was some kind of Soviet operation, then I would assume that they would have had them go in a different direction. That they would either convince them to defect or put them in a position where they could be kidnapped, but that didn't happen. Their presence in Gulf Breeze at the same time as a major UFO convention seems highly suspicious, but exactly what role that was supposed to play is, again, uncertain. So here's one idea, and I don't put this forward as a clear answer, but it's another possibility. That this was indeed a psyop, a psychological operation. But it was a psychological operation aimed by the Army at its own personnel. So one of the questions that could come up is that we have these people who are technicians, who are skilled technicians, supposedly the brightest, the best and the brightest of our enlisted personnel, handling highly sensitive classified equipment and data. How susceptible to these could these people be to influence? So first, let's determine what it is that they're interested in. So we know that we've got a group of people here who are influenced by religious ideas, but also seem to have some kind of general interest in the paranormal. So using those entry points, using things that we know that these people are already inclined to take an interest in, could we manipulate them to the point that they would abandon their posts, throw away their military career, and go off on a wild goose chase? Let's see what happens, and then we'll monitor it. I could see someone coming up with that idea. I think that's a possibility, but it's only that. The other thing is that everybody's in on it. The Gulf Breeze Six or at least let's say that Davis and Beeson are in on it. That they're the ringleaders of the whole thing. And they're seeing whether they can lead the other ones astray. Maybe it was to distract attention from MUFON. I mean, you get into, there are other bits of the stories that come out. Other things that either Davis or Beeson, I think one of those two, are at least alleged to have said, maybe in some cases they did, was that, yes, there is some sort of U.S. government collaboration with aliens, and there are two groups of aliens. There is the Alliance. Okay, and this actually seems to go back to his first, his early spirit friend, Kia. There are the good aliens, the Alliance, and then there are the bad aliens, the others. You know, just like angels and demons. And that the government and the Russians and everybody else deals with both of them in one form or another. And yes, this was, there was something about trying to, well, either this was all something to prevent disclosure or it was a failed attempt at disclosure. I'm not sure how either one of those exactly work, but those, for people who are really into disclosure, you know, think that there is something to be disclosed, then this was either a failed attempt to do so. These guys are trying to blow the lid on the whole thing. And then of course they were told to be silent. I would suspect that has something to do as to why everyone other than Davis has basically never opened their mouth about this, because that was part of the deal that they were made. Okay. You'll get off easy. We'll drop all the charges. You can just walk away from the Army, but you keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
So there is something being concealed in this. There is something that the Army does not want to discuss and no one else wants to discuss, which would then also lead me to only suspect, that Davis's book is simply more part of that story. Eventually he would come forward, tell his version of it. No, there's no Jesus in a flying saucer. There's no Antichrist. There's no the rest of it. And his basic story is that the spirits told us that there was going to be impending cataclysms and that we were going to play some role in this, and we were just there waiting around trying to help. And we thought that was important enough to go AWOL. I don't think I believe that, but then I'm not sure exactly what I do believe. So I guess that brings us to a kind of conclusion. The Gulf Breeze case is a real thing. What the hell was actually going on is still a mystery.